Hi, my name is Phil DeLuna, and I'm running to be a member of Parliament for Toronto St. Paul's in the upcoming federal election. Today, I speak with Luisa Da Silva, Executive Director of Iron and Earth. Iron and Earth is an organization that looks at helping to upskill and train workers from the oil and gas sector to transition to a clean energy economy. This is our conversation. So for today, we have a very special guest. We have Luisa, who is joining us as the executive director of Iron and Earth. I will let her explain about all of what that amazing organization does. But first, Luisa, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what brought you to Iron and Earth?
I'm a geoscientist by training, and I started my career in the oil and gas sector. So I worked on projects that are called SAGD, steam assisted gravity drainage, and we were exploring to understand the extent of the oil and gas deposits in that area. That's really where I started my career. I was working alongside people from all across Canada, from Newfoundland, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Alberta, BC, Ontario. And so really with that kind of lens, I started to see in one place just, what was really important to Canadians. And it was pretty obvious that what was important to Canadians is, being able to provide for their families, being able to put food on the table, roof over their head, get a good education, and just, do all the things that people want. Throughout my career, I spent quite a long time in exploration and mining, and went from being a field geologist to working more on the corporate side. And that for me was really important because as a professional and as a first generation immigrant Canadian, my background is Portuguese. It's very important to also show that diversity and show to other first generation Canadians that you can also have a professional career. So I've tried to always kind of talk to those kinds of communities wherever I go, and yeah, so that's a little bit about my background and how did I come to be at Iron and Earth. Well, a few years back, I started thinking about the mining industry and oil and gas industry and exploration, and there really is this boom and bust cycle to those industries, right? So you can progress in your career and then you're knocked right back because you lose your job, and it's not just your job that's lost, it's the entire industry that goes down. So I started thinking about that and thinking, well, do I want to stay in this kind of situation? And the answer was no. So I looked to see what else is out there, and it was really heartbreaking to make that decision to walk away from something that I identified so strongly with in terms of my professional self, to then go out there and see how can I make a difference? And also, I've always been somebody who's been really interested in the environment and conservation and whatnot. So being out in nature is the thing that makes me the happiest. So I kind of came to work at a conservancy here in Canada. And through that, really saw the path to how I could link up my background in working in oil and gas, going through the experience of those cyclical job losses, with my love of the conservation side. So when I came across Iron and Earth, it just seemed like a no-brainer to me that this is the organization where I can really put my efforts and skills towards to push things forward.
That's beautiful. I love that story. And, it really resonates with me too personally. I'm also a first generation Canadian immigrant. And my dad worked in the automotive sector. And so I experienced that the boom and the bust, and never was there another boom. And I know exactly what it's like, to the point of an entire community and industry that just fades away, and it leaves behind people and families to pick up the pieces. And that's why I think, especially now with the world transitioning to a low carbon economy, how can we protect jobs, livelihoods, people, and ensure that there's a transition destination for them to end up, for them to go to, which is, I think, exactly the mission of what Iron and Earth is. So can you tell us a little bit more about Iron and Earth as an organization and the work that you do?
Absolutely. So Iron and Earth, we have the mission to empower fossil fuel industry and Indigenous workers to create and implement climate solutions. We do this through a variety of initiatives. We have national chapters that are across Canada, and through that, we get to know people in the community, get to understand their energy needs and what it is that they need for their communities. So for example, through our chapter on the East Coast, we worked with Autism Newfoundland to install a 365 greenhouse at their property. So they actually are growing food there 365 days a year and selling it in their organization. We also work with Indigenous communities. Right now, we're working with a community called the Louis Bull Tribe in Muscatcheese, Alberta. And we're bringing in solar install and also wind installations there. And what's really unique with our organization is that we deliver training to fossil fuel industry workers and the Indigenous workers so that they have the skills themselves to be able to go out there and implement these solutions. So once they've installed these solar installs, they'll know how to do this again and again. And so that keeps them employed. We really, so we've released recently our Prosperous Transition Plan, which is a guide for the federal government on how we, Canada, can transition to net zero. Iron and Earth firmly believes that, we've got this really skilled workforce. The oil and gas workers, they have all the technical basic skills, foundation for being able to implement the net zero technologies. All that they need is a little bit of rapid upskilling in order to be able to actually move into that industry. So part of what we advocate for is for the federal government to make that investment into the upskilling, into retooling businesses, into repurposing infrastructure, and also nature-based solutions. And we believe that through those 4 points, Canada can make the transition to net zero economy.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, that's one of the pillars of the platform that I'm running on are green jobs and climate change. And that's specifically it, right? Is to think about that upskilling, to think about all of that. And the fact that the fossil fuel industry has the workers that we need to get us to that net zero world. If I may ask a question though, some would say, especially those who are potentially a little bit more passionate or on the left side of the environmental movement, unfortunately, I've seen folks like this, and I've felt the increasing polarization between politically and otherwise, between the oil and gas sector and potentially environmentalist groups. And here we have Iron and Earth, which is really looking to be a bridge between that in a way. What have you found in that space when you're talking to oil and gas folks or people from the oil and gas sector about environmentalism? What's the reaction there? And when you're talking to folks who care about the climate and say that you're supporting oil and gas workers, how do they react? What are you finding at both ends of that spectrum?
So what's really interesting about Iron and Earth is that, like you say, we very much sit at the middle of those conversations. Iron and Earth was founded in 2016 around the tables of the lunchrooms of the oil sands in Fort McMurray. And people were having conversations with each other, realizing that, they could see the writing on the wall, climate change is happening, and starting to look around at their own activities and how it is that they're, making their livelihood, and starting to see, okay, what is it that I'm doing and how is this impacting the environment? So the organization really was founded to enable those conversations and really empower people to be able to have those conversations in a safe space. Mm-hmm. And that really is key, because what we find is, so for example, we have one, we hear this from a lot of different workers, but one worker that really stands out in my mind is that he went to a climate action justice meeting, and, he was the only oil and gas person there, and really was fearful about expressing his opinions on concerns for climate change, for fear that there might be backlash, that he might lose his job. I mean, he still works in the oil and gas industry, but would love to transition out, right? So we have all of these different voices, people that are working in the oil and gas industry, but see the need for change. The oil and gas companies themselves, they support us because they're also looking for their own pathway to net zero. There's definitely a business case for having these industries, but not necessarily as they have been used in the past, right? We can get our energy needs from alternative sources, from other sources, sources that are either zero emissions or net to zero emissions. So let's implement those and leave oil and gas for the things that we absolutely have to use that for.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more again. And you know, it's interesting how oil and gas workers fear a backlash and maybe perhaps being ostracized, whether that's by their company themselves or maybe even by their peers and their coworkers, for speaking out or being, you know, more concerned about the climate. But I'm curious, have you found that the climate activists or those who hold these rallies themselves are wary or cynical or skeptical of oil and gas workers? Does it go both ways, that tension?
I can't speak for the people on the ground, but I can voice what it is that we are told. And what we're told is that, yeah, people that are working in oil and gas currently, they are concerned about that backlash, but more so they're concerned about the loss of their identity, because this is what they've known their entire life. This has been their profession. This has been their career. A lot of these people, we have to remember, right? This is really their identity, and it's the thing that they go to absolutely every single year, year after year. So it's really a part of their livelihood. What about the people that, for example, they finished high school and then they went and worked in the oil sands? So they don't have a degree to fall back on to use and pivot somewhere else. We have to be remembering these people and making sure that they can come through the just transition. So for them, what we hear is that it's you know, what does that mean if I transition away? What's next on the horizon for me? And there's also a bit of an age difference there too. What we saw in our Abacus poll, which is unsurprising, is people that are 45 and younger, they're more than happy to, you know, take some upskilling and move, and they feel that they would thrive in the net zero economy. Whereas people that are 45 and older, you know, they're looking more at the winding down of their career. So is going into a 4-year program what they really want to do? Probably not, right? But if they could have that shortened time period of upskilling, then they don't have that loss of identity. It really then becomes, this is how you're transitioning your career, not necessarily you. So there definitely has to be a focus on that. That's not an area that can be ignored through this just transition. It really is speaking to the confidence of how people feel that they can actually thrive in that net zero economy.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting because I feel that this has happened across North America, in the Midwest. It's happened in Southern Ontario, well, during the loss of our manufacturing base and shutting down of auto plants and auto workers whose livelihoods exactly the same thing. And I feel like today it's even exacerbated by the fact that cost of living has increased so much, right? And a lot of these good paying jobs where you could support a family, you could put your kids through school, you could put food on the table, is that, I think, you know, I remember when my dad lost his job, there was a lot of stress about, well, what's next after that, right? And I think that a lot of the oil and gas sector is seeing that and as well. And it's so difficult because we know that we have to get to net zero. We know that we have to get there. So I'll ask this next question, which is for Iron and Earth, like what's next in terms of the organization? You just started as the executive director. What's your vision going forward, and how are you hoping to scale the amazing work that's being done even further?
So we do this through a variety of different initiatives, but the two that are coming to mind immediately, first one is we're working on a climate career portal right now, which will address a lot of those challenges and barriers that workers face. So through that, they'll be able to, like, let's say, for example, you're an electrician, you type in electrician, immediately you're going to see, here's how your skills are useful. Here's the kinds of projects where you can work in. Here's the kind of companies that are working in that sector right now where you could be useful. And also, here's some organizations that are currently offering upskilling or retraining for people just like you. We're also going to be having a feature that has a job search on there, because it's actually quite difficult to currently come across jobs in the renewable
Yep.
or net zero sector, right? For these kinds of skilled workers. So that's the first thing that we're currently working on in the short term. And on our longer horizon, but also on the short term, we're looking at launching a social enterprise within the organization. And that's going to be focused on that rapid upskilling of the workers right across Canada so that they can have the skills to move into net zero. We're looking to move, thousands of people from the jobs where they've been. And to your point earlier, when you were asking the question, the thing about, the concerns about moving jobs that we have to keep in mind is that maybe the oil and gas sector paid incredibly well, but the jobs were very unreliable and they are boom and bust, right? So the jobs in the net zero economy, the difference in pay is really not that great from what people are making now. But the biggest difference is that you're going to have a stable and reliable job. And so that's what we want to focus on at the organization, getting people upskilled so that they can move into net zero, so that they can move into the 1 million plus forecasted jobs that are going to be created in this new economy.
That's fantastic, because I think that's a perspective that's lost, right? Is that it really is a boom and bust cycle. And then, when you speak to workers about consistency and stability, in a way, I would argue that that's more valuable than potentially, a higher revenue paying but short-term job. There's one thing that I wanted to touch on, which you spoke about earlier, was your work with Indigenous communities. And I think that's fascinating because you typically don't necessarily think of Indigenous communities and oil and gas workers having much overlap. But the idea of training, of upskilling, of empowering these communities, whether they're oil and gas workers or whether they're Indigenous peoples, to provide for themselves and to be a part of that clean energy economy and that low carbon economy of the future, there really is a lot of overlap. So can you tell me a little bit more about how your organization is working with Indigenous peoples, what that interaction has been like? And, just as oil and gas workers are not a monolith, Indigenous peoples are not a monolith. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you've seen so far.
I'm not sure how many Canadians are aware of this, but there's quite a lot of communities in Canada, particularly Indigenous communities and mostly the remote communities, that are 100% diesel dependent.
Yep.
So all of their energy comes from diesel, right? So they're also at the fringe, and they're at the most vulnerable of this transition that's going to happen. They can't be left behind. So what our organization does is that we work with these communities. We have listening phases where we listen to what it is that they want to do and how it is that they want to diversify their energy needs. And we work with them to implement those solutions. We've been primarily focused on solar and wind, and that's really because those are the two most tangible right now. The cost of solar has really come down, so it's very affordable to be able to install in these communities. But going into the future, we want to be looking into hydrogen, we want to look into geothermal, we want to look into all the gamut, the entire scope of solutions that are available to these communities. When we work with these communities, it is such a unique experience because, for example, the Muscatcheese Community College that we're working with right now on installing solar panels to their college building, when that installation happens, we're going to be training the youth of the community to understand, how this installation can happen and also pathways to net zero. They have a sweat ceremony, they have a pipe ceremony, they have a feast. So also the fossil fuel workers that come into that training program experience that Cree cross-cultural experience and really get to understand, the ways of Indigenous knowing and learning and sharing of their information. It is really quite special. And I don't know that there's any other programs in Canada that are like that.
That is amazing. That is amazing. And again, a theme that I'm seeing here is really bridging divides, right? And I think that's another one. This is just a comment. News has been made recently of boil water advisories in Indigenous First Nations and remote communities all over Canada. And a lot of people have said that it's the upskilling, the training, being able to maintain these units or what have you. Has Iron and Earth ever looked into expanding beyond just clean technology and also into sort of infrastructure like water remediation?
So we look at it from four perspectives, right? We look at it from the upskilling of the workers, the retooling and repurposing of existing manufacturers, existing businesses, but also nature-based solutions. Mm. And so nature-based solutions, I think, really is the part where Indigenous workers will have the biggest role. Because the thing that we have to keep in mind that actually I meant to touch on earlier is that the Indigenous communities in oil and gas is not that strange. Remember where these communities are, and then remember where these oil and gas projects are. They tend to be pretty remote. Mm. So that's kind of like the thing that's down the street where, you can find the employment. So coming back to the, clean water solutions and whatnot, that for me falls into the nature-based solutions, right? It falls into how is it that we can implement, these projects that address, social issues and also address, keeping the land green and clean, and, the solutions that can produce even negative emissions, right? Mm. Take emissions back out of the atmosphere. So yeah, there's a world of possibilities out there for things that we can be moving into.
Well, that's exciting, and it's so needed. And I just want to congratulate you again and the work that your organization is doing. It's really, really exciting. Beyond that, I will ask one last question, which is there anything else that you'd like our viewers or listeners to know, and anything that we haven't touched on?
I think people need to know that we're very hopeful. We're very hopeful of what lies ahead. We know that, change is scary and we don't have all the answers. There's going to be gaps that haven't been addressed or that people haven't thought of. But the sooner that we start moving towards moving to a net zero economy, this will snowball. The businesses will be able to transition. They'll be able to retool themselves into, retrofitting the buildings and these kinds of things. It will snowball, it will gain momentum, and we'll be seeing a clear path to implementing net zero in Canada.
That is an amazing message to end on. I'm leaving this conversation very hopeful too. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Phil. My pleasure.